Hello and welcome to the People Value Stream. So today we are joined by Professor Peter Hines and Cheryl Jekiel, who will be introducing the People Value Stream and really giving you an understanding of the new sort of research that they're doing within the People Value Stream arena and working together to bring Lean and HR together to really help organizations to optimize their end-to-end process and really maximize the potential of their people. So the People Value Stream has recently been set up by Professor Peter Hines and Cheryl Jekiel to really drive forward this way of thinking to help organizations. So today we will be focusing on what the People Value Stream is. Professor Peter Hines is going to give an introduction first into the background behind it all and the model, and then we're going to hand over to Cheryl Jekiel, who will look more from an HR perspective into this. And this really is also to introduce the latest program that we have, which we hope we can sign you all up for, which really deep dives into what we're going to be hearing of today. Okay, so I will just hand over to Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, to everyone attending. So really a little bit of background to this. Probably most of you either coming from a lean or similar background or more an HR background is what we've long noticed is that maybe people on the left-hand side of the bridge, or what Toyota might call continuous improvement, Toyota production system, lean, etc., often come from operations, supply chain, maybe engineering background. So quite a technical background often, and often this approach is interpreted in quite a technical tools and methods way, and obviously has huge benefits, but doesn't necessarily engage and create long-term sustainability. Whereas in most organizations, we see people on the right-hand side of the bridge, perhaps some HR, change management, OD, for example, trying to work more on the culture change, the leadership side of things. And again, the struggle they have perhaps is that people might see this as a little bit sort of, I don't know, artificial or maybe not as real or tangible or delivering the tangible results that we might see on the left-hand side. And actually what we realize is that you actually need both sides of this to work together, but often it doesn't work together. It's two different teams, and actually we even struggle, the two sides of the bridge, to talk the same language and maybe with the same sort of mindset or whatever. So Cheryl and I have spent the last, I guess, year and a half trying to work out how to bring these two sides of the bridge together. So if we go on to the next slide. So if we think about this, much like using the value stream map that we're all familiar with as a sort of framework or cartoon for this, is perhaps what we see in many organizations is that we have a traditional sort of batch and queue type environment. And instead of looking at the product value stream, the well-known value stream map that we're all familiar with, if we think about this as the life cycle of people, so the customer is probably the team they work in or the line manager, and then HR is probably the equivalent of production control, and HR is often organized through sub-functions, the sort of departments that you might see here, recruitment, employee relations, compensation, etc. And supply is make or buy. And then if we think of the individual, that actually they're being managed much like we might have in manufacturing, in each stage in a different way. So we don't really have a flow, and actually for the individual it maybe doesn't feel as positive as it might, which means that individuals perhaps leave before they might, and they don't add as much value as they might, because we're not really maximizing the flow in the same way that a pre-lean we wouldn't be maximizing the flow of the product or the information going through. So if we have a look at the next slide. So this was some of the very early thinking in this space, that what we needed to start thinking about was actually developing pull and developing flow and thinking about the HR elements and thinking about the management elements. So that was the early thinking, and together with Cheryl in particular, a couple of other colleagues as well, we started to refine that into the next picture, which hasn't yet got into a nice graphic, but anyway, it's sort of informative. And what you can see is it's really quite busy, this slide. So we're going to sort of go through it step by step. And I'm going to take you through the first two parts, and Cheryl will take you through the second part. So what we really realized was, for most organizations in the classic lean, we really start with the needs of the organization and the strategy and the deployment and etc. And eventually this comes down to the individual. But by the time this comes down to the individual, quite often it doesn't have a lot of meaning for the individual. And you know, frankly, how many of us are engaged with, you know, improving, making more profit, growing the market share of the organization if we're doing particularly a frontline role in the organization? These are things that really don't mean very much to us. So the thinking that we did is really that, okay, yes, we do need to have the strategy deployment, and yes, we do need to have all the sort of good stuff that we know, but actually, how do we make this meaningful for the individual themselves? And how can we actually start from their perspective rather than just start from the top of the organization's perspective? So if you go back to the builds a bit, Emma, so the starting place is actually with what does the individual want to get out of it? What's in it for me? How can I connect to the organization? So I'm going to start looking at that, and I'll touch on some of these flows, and then Cheryl will take us into the wider implications and what we need to do in thinking about how HR needs to move forward and how the management and KPIs. And what you'll see in this very brief half an hour is there's some fairly major implications of some of the things that we're talking about. So if we move on to the next slide. Okay, so if we go back to thinking about lean, and we start to think about lean, and we link this to some of the psychology behind how people, individuals tick. And what we can actually see is that some of the lean stuff, particularly in the very tools and technique organizations, is not actually that positive for people. So it's more a negative psychology rather than positive psychology. And in fact, all of you listening, you know, we can all debate whether in fact the term lean is actually a good term, because for many people that conjures up cutting jobs and so forth. But if we think about some of the things that we do in lean in a psychological perspective, and one of the best psychology theories is by a couple of American psychologists called Ryan and Dechi. And what they introduce is in so-called self-determination theory. In other words, how can I actually achieve the best for myself? They talk about three things that are really important for all of us as individuals, and I think you can appreciate this for yourself. Is all of us like to have a reasonable degree of autonomy. We like to decide what to do. We don't want to be told. We don't want to work in a command and control. So if we just build on this one, so what we started to look at is, let's think about lean in terms of these areas of autonomy, competence. In other words, I want to be the best I can at whatever whatever I'm doing, for example, and relatedness. I want to be in a community. We are social beings. We don't want to be on our own. We want to work with people. We want to work with people that we like and get on with, etc. And if we think about some of the things we do in lean, it's a mostly top-down approach. So that's not necessarily good for autonomy. Standard work, which obviously could be very standardized in the shop floor sort of environment, is not necessarily a positive psychology. But positive is that we create an environment for bottom-up ideas. So that's good from autonomy. Competence, if the skills and training is pushed at people from HR. So how many organizations present have we trained a lot of green and black belt and yellow belt people who don't know why they're being trained, never get a chance to use it, and actually we're just pushing this at them rather than responding to what they need. And relatedness is basically, the good things is perhaps we work in a team, we solve problems together, but actually most of the focus on personal development planning is just on the job, not the wider experience in the workplace. So if we go on to the next slide. So really, what we're saying here is that we need to be thinking about turning the organization upside down. And actually, the autonomy needs to be high for the individual rather than just for the CEO, but the support needs to be at the management and leader level. And you've probably seen slides like this before, but my reflection, having looked at some of the psychology and done the work with Cheryl that we've done, is that really we're playing at this. We're nowhere near actually getting this right and understanding really how to do this. And how can we do this if we don't really understand the needs of the individual? We don't have a way of listening to the voice of the employee properly. So if we move on, look at the next slide. And so we actually have to go into a little bit of brain science here. So if we think about how the brain works, there's 4 levels to the brain, 4 levels of thinking inside of the brain. So the lowest level is actually an automatic reflex reaction. So if you pick up, I don't know, a saucepan or something like that that's boiling hot, or you put your hand in a flame or something like that, you just immediately put it out. So that's just instinctive reaction. So that's the most primitive, immediate reaction to danger. And as you build up the brain, you actually do cleverer thinking as you go on and upwards. So the 3rd level of the brain is the limbic brain. And the limbic brain is the feeling, the emotional side of the brain. So for instance, if you think about something in your home life or your work life that's really good or really bad, you generally will have an emotional reaction. You'll either have a very positive feel, I want to do more of this is fantastic, or you'll have a rather negative feel, this is not for me, and you'll zone out. So actually how the brain works, before we get to the top, which is the cortex, which is the smart part of the brain, it's the thinking part of the brain, we go through this emotional thing. Now the problem with lean is if the psychology is negative and we actually don't treat people with respect, and we get them into an emotionally negative place through negative psychology, they don't even get into the cortex. The thinking doesn't get to that level. So if we're approaching them with PDCA, DMAIC, all sorts of other scientific, logical approaches, which are all very good, but actually we haven't passed the limbic test, then we're not going to engage people, we're not going to create motivation, we're not going to get discretionary effort. So actually, we believe you need to work by thinking not just on the cortex, the PDCA, you need to work on the limbic, and in fact there's even an argument you should do that before you actually work on the cortex. So we started to think about this and said, well, instead of just thinking of the logical, lean, scientific, which we know a lot about and there's fantastic work on, we need to think about this feeling brain and a lot of the sort of more people orientated, how can we feel good about things? So if we look at the next slide. So what we did is we started to think about, well, what about if we develop the equivalent of plan, do, check, act, but actually in terms of how do we feel about some things? And some of you, maybe when you do a Kaizen event, you might do a wrap up and said, well, how good was the result on a 1 to 5 scale? And how did we feel about the result? And maybe if you've got a 4 or 5 out of 5 for the result, but a 1 or 2 out of we didn't feel good, well, maybe next time it isn't going to be a good result. So that's the sort of thinking. So taking the psychology behind this, and there's a huge amount of depth behind this, is the starting point is actually creating meaning for the individual, which is a bit like the strategy formation process and then into deployment. So that is, what do I want to achieve in terms of my purpose and my belief that this is the right thing to do and it's possible, etc. That's a bit like the strategy. And then how can I flow? So like a flow in terms of the lean sense, but flow in terms of in the flow, in the zone, I've got a positive feel, I'm zoned in, I really want to do this stuff, which is about improving the competency of individuals and their connection to the world. So this is thinking about the world from the individual point of view. How did I feel? Has it created meaning? How am I developing myself, gaining connection? Reflect periodically, maybe on a simple short term, this might be a daily reflection, but longer term, it might be around the longer term life goals that I have, monthly, quarterly, which might be a better way to go prepared into personal development planning than the traditional approach that we see, which often employees hate and line managers hate, and it becomes a bit of a tick the box exercise. And then after you've done reflection, which is mostly around positive achievements and not what's going wrong, but opportunities, so at least we use a positive language, we can then move forward into act in terms of what do I need to do, what do I need to improve, how can I work with people, and how can I pull support from peers or HR or my line manager. So in other words, what we're trying to do here is create the same sort of lean thinking. We're trying to create focus on the customer. In this case, the customer is the individual. We're trying to create flow, we're trying to create pull, we're trying to look at the whole value stream or the flows that we've got here and achieve perfection. In other words, the best we can for the person. So the next slide. So in terms of meaning, I won't go through this in huge depth, and this is obviously why we wanted to put a course together to actually give you more detail than we're able to do in a few minutes here. To create meaning, it's about what am I good at? What am I strong at? What do I value? What am I passionate about? And that will drive my life goals and link that to what the organization needs, but something that I can make sense of myself, create meaning. And those four give me the purpose. So my purpose, what am I trying to achieve in the organization? And that links together with things I might have a strong personal belief in, as well as beliefs or values or behavior that the organization is trying to achieve. And then if I can get my purpose and my belief set, I can create meaning, and then I can go off starting to look at the flows to improve myself. So I think my final slide is just coming up. So if you look at the center part here, so if I've created this meaning and I've created some sort of self-development, or we started to use the word tier 0, because you can think about this as your own personal cockpit, whether that's on an A3 or on a PC, or it's a little wall chart next to you, thinking about this for yourself, so your own journey for growth and development. And then we can start thinking about, for you as an individual, and what support do you need in terms of how do I learn and progress in my role or roles, which is not necessarily up, up, up. It might be up, across, across, up, across, across. So in other words, life's much more about mastery rather than promotion, because we can't all be the CEO of the organization. It's about developing my values and the company values and behaviors, etc. It's about me taking greater accountability for my development, my career, and pull things from the organization. It's about how do I contribute more to the team I'm in. It's about receiving support and recognition, creating that solid environment, participating in community inclusion, which is about not just the day job stuff, but quite often to create these high levels of motivation engagement. It's things that are not necessarily in the sort of 9 to 5, but it might be the before work, the after work, or at the lunchtime. It might be that social interaction, the sort of walking club or the sports group or something like that actually creates the engagement, as well as the physical and mental well-being, which obviously is a hot topic. So really what this is about is we start with the needs of the individual, we then grow and develop them through these various flows. So that's really the first two elements. And of course, if we're turning the organization upside down, we need a quite different way of thinking about the people and culture, or the HR side, and around the leadership. So Cheryl's going to take over and take us through those sections.
Yes, so as you've listened to all of this, and even as Peter and I worked, I was like, Peter, I get all this personal meaning, but what is it going to mean to the organization? I mean, a business still has a purpose, or an organization has a purpose. When we get into the measures, it becomes very clear why would this be the way an organization might want to think about the people streams. So we want to figure out, what would we be measuring first? Just like anything in continuous improvement, how can we tell if it's getting better? So we would need to be thinking about what are we going to measure, how are we going to measure it, because whenever it comes to people parts, it's a little more challenging, and why would we measure it? So with that, I'm going to go through a couple of the options here. One is we can measure skills and abilities. So we can get a sense of, from a personal point of view, how are people building new skills and abilities? Because we know that that has meaning to them, because what they experience is abilities they didn't have before. And the next one is certainly behavior indicators. So we can measure behaviors. And again, they may be something that the organization wants to see. It could be things that just tell us that the person is progressing in terms of personal meaning to themselves. So we could find certain specific behaviors we're looking for. And next, this is the big one from my point of view. So I've spent much of my time focusing on what is engagement, how do you measure engagement, why does it matter? So certainly being able, we could tell if those flows are progressing, then we should be able to certainly be able to get a clear sense that engagement is increasing. Certainly less, just as important is figuring out, so we know that people are hardwired based on positive psychology to want to feel recognized, and so we can measure, again, not as an organization, how many times do we recognize, but from an individual, how many times am I recognized? So we want to always keep that personal meaning in mind, not just the organizational aspect in mind. And I think last is certainly common practice in many lean organizations is measuring ideas, but we want to be thinking about it. We're measuring them from the person. So if I'm John or Sue, how many times have I had an idea that was at least recognized in any way? Doesn't mean it was necessarily implemented. Not just we've had 100 ideas, how many ideas per person, and thinking again from an individual perspective. So those are the, and then including our mental and physical. So that was the last piece that was in the flows, is how would we measure that? And this one is often overlooked. It's how can we tell if people are mentally and physically better? Now, I've been in some organizations, they measure physical wellness and certain key measurements, but mental health is not something, again, that's been traditionally measured. But again, we'd hope if people are flowing well in their work life, we would be able to see indications from that can be measured. So all of this matters because to an organization, so to the individuals, this will see what is mattering to them. What we're going to see then in the lagging measures, the organizational measures, are the results of this, and they are profound. So in the end, this tremendous focus, we believe, on the personal flow yields even much stronger business outcomes or organizational outcomes. I'm just going to go through a few of these. So one is, we know, first of all, there is much research from many, I've gone through every paper, every book that I could locate, and it's well researched that increased engagement and other individual wellness type indicators, you're going to see increased shareholder value and growth. So we know there's clear alignment. We will also see better just general business metrics, so whether or organizational metrics, quality or cost or delivery of services or products, those will all generally be enhanced. The better the individuals are doing, the better the organization is doing. We'll certainly have people metrics that will then also show up as results, better retention, better attendance, better safety, many more of those. Those again, all create better profitability and performance of an organization. So who are the customers to all this? So in one way we said our original thinking was, well, it's the team or the leadership, but in fact, there's really more than one customer of wanting to make sure that organizational experiences and meaning is optimized. So the first thing we've been thinking about is what does it mean to the team? So to the individuals are generally working within teams. How is the team interested in making sure the people on the team are having the best experience possible? So that's one. Second is how do the leadership? So we also know from many times, many of us are in leadership teams. We're trying to figure out what's the best way for everybody to get engaged or do what we want to have done and achieve the goals. Thinking about they certainly have a lot to gain from figuring this out. External customers, certainly not the least, they have a vested interest in interacting or receiving benefits, products, services from organizations that optimize how people are flowing. And then the last one is certainly the ownership interest. So there's different types of stakeholders to this, but we want to be thinking that there really are very clear customers to this that have an interest in optimizing these flows. Now we're going to get to, so much of my work in my life has been in the field of human resources. So it was interesting for me as Peter and I have been progressing down this road, considering what has been traditional HR approaches to things and always knowing that it still felt like it had a whole lot more push than pull to it. So we gave some thought about what needs to shift for how HR or in general leadership functions to help create that space, which can't only almost fully be controlled. So with that, I'm going to go through some of the ways to think about how those things might need to shift from here. So we want to be thinking about how do we provide a way for there to be continually shifting roles with strategic competencies. That means how is the person experiencing flow in their career? There's many implications to that, to how we define how movement is created, but aligning that to the organizational needs. So it's a matter that they need to be aligned and connected. We're going to be wanting then to develop skills. Again, that individual needs to feel that sense of learning and ability, but then putting that into well-defined career paths. Many times the well-defined career paths are not quite in place, and then you'll see, again, a lot of times individuals, I can't see how I need to come through. How can I optimize my goals in the midst of this organizational flow? And next, certainly, people, it's not just how they're paid, like as if they're monetarily, money does matter to them. I think it's also a matter of them feeling like they can self-determine. Based on what things I achieve or do, can I drive my compensation? It's more than just the money, it's whatever it also means to people. Am I progressing in the way that I want to progress? There's lots of meaning attached to all of that. We want to make sure that we are getting things aligned so that there's an integration of culture. There's much that in our work and that we've been delving into is making sure we're creating adult-adult environments, like removing things that feel more parental or more parent-child orientation. How do we create more adult-adult environments? And certainly, how does communication of all shapes, sizes, and kinds play into that? So really wanting to look for ways that we drive a very aligned work environment. And then certainly, one of the things I've known for the last 20 years, people say you can't actually engage, you can't actually empower people. They have to empower. We can create an environment that engages people, but you cannot literally engage them. So this is, how can we sponsor environments that lead to engagement, not that you can actually directly engage people. So it's getting clear from how we develop programs, how do we foster those things. So how will this apply to, we're going to be working in a workshop to look at different implications about how this turns into, so what do we do about all of this? So one is, it's re-examining the paradigms. I realize in most of my working life, in all my HR roles, there was always a sense like we create the program so then something happens. But realizing it's not the same, a people value stream, a personal flow, it's not the same as a people process. So it's really rethinking how do we structure things and why, what's behind that, really re-examining those and get underneath it so that we can optimize personal meaning by thinking more, how do people function? How are they wired? What do they need? So there's lots of paradigms to examine. Next. We really want to be thinking about teams as they're individuals. They're not literally just teams. I'll always say, they'll say, how do we get my group to change? And I'm like, there's completely separate people. They change in individual ways. So we want to be looking at everything from how we work with our teams as how does it match to what the individual needs. And so how do you do that? this is not, to me, is one of the bigger pieces. It's really being clear, what do we control and what don't we control? Like, as I said, you can't actually empower a person. You can create an environment that they empower themselves. So as we get clear what we do and don't control, we get better at how to structure programming or supports or systems and processes that best optimize how people bring themselves through. This, again, I have focused on this concept for the last probably 10 years, the most. How do we shift everything we do from pull versus push? How do we create things that are available when needed, but not like we keep pushing them through? From a talent management system, we need to create those that foster a desired work environment, meaning we encourage something so that people can do their best, which in turn achieves those best results. So all of this in the end, if we can't show that it actually yields better outcomes, it can end up sounding like, oh, we just want to create a gentler, kinder society, as I'll say. The truth is, if we create this better workplace, you're going to have those better results. So we need to be looking then at what in our talent management systems may need to be restructured or redesigned to provide that environment where people have the experience that we're hoping for, which again can only be fostered, not controlled. So that could be meaning looking at how training and development is done. So that's really one, there's tons of challenges. We can explore what those challenges might be and how do you recreate training and development to be more pull rather than push? How do we have things ready for when people have that time, they're ready to learn or develop something instead of everybody's gonna all learn this now. And then again, many of them actually don't actually have the experience that we're hoping for. So what we want to do is seek to enhance and leverage as much as we can have individuals have their greatest fulfillment, will have the best results. So in exploring this and optimizing this, we do believe in the end it drives better results. So how do we think about that? How do we measure that? One of the most interesting things I found is people say, many organizations will be like, we don't care about the money. We don't care about the numbers. It's really, we believe in people, and so it doesn't matter. But what I do know for sure, these things take investment. And if we can't show clearly how they tie to metrics and numbers, then it can be hard for people to justify the time, the resources, the focus, the energy of why to go in this direction. So even for organizations say, well, we're not numbers oriented, there'd be a reason that you'd want to do it that way. So that's just a highlight about what the how this turns into things we need to explore and consider.
Okay, thanks very much, Cheryl. Just before we go into the question and answers session, as we've been referring to, the People Value Stream Learning and Development Programme is very much a deep dive into what Peter and Cheryl have been touching upon this afternoon. So just to give you a bit more background, you will actually receive this as a handout. So you should be able to see a handout tab on your control panel that has the program there for you to download, and hopefully we can see you on the program. So if you download that, you can then actually fill it out and email it back to me. But I'll send a follow-up email with instructions on how to do that. So the Learning and Development Programme is very much a deep dive into what we've learned about, and is held over 5 half-day virtual workshops. The first one being on the 22nd of October. And these are very much going to be an interactive workshop held over 3 hours, presented either by Professor Peter Hines or Cheryl Jekiel, and will also include guest speakers from best practice companies and experts who are very much going through this new type of learning. So you'll also have the opportunity to network with like-minded individuals. There'll be Q&A sessions and workshops, which, as Cheryl mentioned, the workshops will very much focus on the how can you apply this? So how does this resonate with you? How can you overcome these challenges? And you'll be able to leave with an actual sort of blueprint framework to take back to your organization to hopefully improve and optimize your people and your end-to-end process for the overall people value stream. So yes, you will find out more about this in the follow-up email, or you can download the handout now and email it back to myself. Okay, so that's the end of the workshop. So now I invite everyone to ask any questions they have for Peter and Cheryl using the questions tab. Thank you. Okay, so we have one question from Steve, who has asked, interesting stuff, how do you encourage people and mechanism to get people's ideas across?
So I wasn't quite sure what the question was. Do you want to read that out again, Emma?
Yeah, so Steve has asked, how do you encourage people and mechanisms to get people's ideas across? I.e., suggestion schemes are very difficult to give timely feedback and to encourage motivation.
Yeah, Peter, you want, if you go, we can both respond to it. Why don't you go first?
Okay, well, I mean, there's two levels to this. So one is, I think if you're looking at like the team participation part of what I find is, let's say you've got the daily huddle for 15 minutes or whatever. For me, that is the mechanism. So you should wait no longer than 24 hours from the idea being raised to a conversation. The individual raising the idea should lead that conversation, and the peer community and the team leader should then have a conversation on, are we going to use this? Are we going to do it? Do we need further help, etc.? So for me, that's the absolute way to do it. So not putting it into some suggestion scheme that senior managers look at, months later and never getting any feedback. The other thing is actually around this framework we talked about, the meaning, etc., is actually a more fundamental level for people to actually express what do they want, what are they trying to achieve, either on day-by-day basis or their longer-term career as well. And from that, they develop, if you like, their own tier board, if you like, in a simple way for themselves, which can then bring ideas, get them focused on what they need to achieve, which can then link into things where they need support. So that could be or HR, or this could be an idea I take into the team meeting. So those would be the two areas I would think here.
And I would add on a couple of more, so I would agree with all of that. In addition, I think one of the pieces, one of the things we've been exploring is what needs to be different with leaders. And what I often find is that the leaders receiving the ideas, like even in those huddles, aren't necessarily, they hear the idea just as an idea, like I think we should do whatever, and they respond to the idea without necessarily thinking about the importance. So when I've asked, let's say, a group of people, even leaders, have you ever had, when's the last time you maybe shared an idea and it didn't go well? And they'll say, yes, I raised an idea. Someone said, we've done that already. Then they say they never offer another one after that. So it's really helping the leadership team realize the importance of people sharing their ideas and how do they engage with that more clearly. Second thing that I've seen us making more strides towards is not making it so much like one leader is the one that evaluates an idea or implements ideas. It still tends to bottleneck. So when you flip it more upside down, it's like, what does the team think about the idea? How could the team help move it forward? Because when it's very much like only one person's going to decide if that idea has merit, it kind of chokes them off, much less if any good ideas I have to now take charge of. So it's really thinking through how ideas flow as well.
Okay, Steve said, thank you, 100% agree. Another one from Vladimir. Can Peter give a few more examples of leading measurements, e.g. regarding behaviors and engagement? Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll probably both have a go at this. I think in terms of behaviors, I think there's two ways to think about the behaviors. So one is we can think about the behaviors as they deploy through the organization. So we might start with company values, or we might use a set of principles like from Shingo or Toyota or wherever like that. And from that, we often find organizations really don't, it's nice posters on the wall, but it doesn't mean anything. So then we have an approach of turning those into a set of behaviors, for instance, for the site level. So this might be a behavior such as I consult people before making decisions, for example, or I don't make a decision before I've gone to the Gemba, for example. So that might be generically a good behavior we have at the site level, but then we need to translate that. Well, what does that mean if I'm in the IT department? What does that mean if I'm in the warehouse? What does that mean if I'm in a front line on the shop floor? And obviously it's quite different for different environments. So the deployment down, the team can then, exactly as Cheryl was saying, the more it's the team and the individual doing it and deciding what does that behavior mean to me, and in fact, bottom up, what can I commit to as an individual in a team discussion? What would I like my boss to commit to, the team leader? And then what would I like from the senior managers in that behavior? So the exact formation of the behaviors comes up. And then if the individual level, like in this tier 0, I might be saying, well, oh, this is all the stuff the business wants, and I can see the sense of that. Well, what does that mean to me? And what are my values and what are my behaviors? How does this knit together? And what might be a couple of things I need to work on in terms of my personal behaviors over the next 6 months, 12 months, or whatever? And what support do I need from other people, team members, coaches, buddies, you know, whatever it is. So that's one way of behaviors. Maybe I'll leave the sort of lead engagement and stuff for Cheryl to have a go at sort of some of those fishes. I won't talk forever.
Yeah, I was just thinking though, actually, how much energy I've seen with people tracking their own behaviors. With, you know, like almost anybody, if you said, what do you want to be working on? I want to be a better listener. I want to, you know, be different with my people. I want to be more patient or more allow better for their ideas. If they get clear for themselves what those ideas are, they really like applying the continuous improvement principles to themselves. They get a lot out of that, but not to say the least, it's about the support. It's just like any kind of teamwork. When they share what they want for themselves with each other, there's a power from that is amazing, and I think really makes all the difference. So I've definitely become a believer that community that does that is a big piece of that. In terms of engagement, I've certainly been looking at, for the last several years, different ways of measuring it. I've been a fan partly of something as simple as like the Gallup system. It's 12 simple questions. They certainly have a ton of research that proves the validity of it. Certainly not the only way to do it. I'm not a big fan of the real long 60, 70, 80 word. It just creates so much data, no one knows what to do with it. The biggest piece I have become a fan of is that the teams own the results. It's their work lives, it's their community. The misnomer that somehow whatever's going right or wrong is from leadership, and so leadership hears the results, leadership is now going to go fix it, doesn't work. And so the more that the teams own their own engagement, that's really what the fundamental difference is. They have to control their own engagement. All we can do is help and support and foster, but we can't make that happen for them.
Okay, thank you.
We could probably go on for half a day actually on this question, but maybe. Yeah.
So we have one here from Deirdre, who said people's involvement in meetings can be subjective and the quality or the value determined by the other participants. How would you measure such a thing in an objective manner that's fair to the participant?
Ooh, that's interesting.
That's a good question. Could you just read it one more time?
Yeah. People's involvement in meetings can be subjective and the quality determined by the other participants. How would you measure such a thing in an objective manner that's fair to the participant?
I think the first bit is, have we got the right people going to the right meetings in the first place? And this is where some of the leader standard work would come in, that we actually have less meetings, they're shorter, they're with the right people, and we don't get people sitting there, and we've all been in meetings thinking, what on earth am I doing here? I've got nothing to contribute, I'm getting really bored, etc. So that's the first one. But if you think about the meaning, the flow, and the reflect, this would be in that reflect box. So at the end of the day, each day, if you're going around that sort of cycle as a sort of reflection, you might be saying, well, I was in this meeting, what was some good stuff out of it that I was really positive, and what is the one opportunity? So the opportunity might be, well, I only needed to be there for 5 minutes, so I didn't need to be there the whole day, which then triggers what support do I need, which is then triggering and justifying to you to then have a conversation with your line manager or the peers or whoever was running the meeting and saying, well, you know, did you actually need me at the meeting, or how could I contribute more? And actually have an honest conversation rather than going on and on, going to meetings that aren't really valuable, etc. So the more you can turn it into a positive than a, I'm going to slag Cheryl off because she went on and on about something that wasn't relevant. Well, we're trapped in the process. It's not Cheryl's issue. Cheryl was doing what she was trying to do, etc. I shouldn't have been there. I wasn't contributing, and hence we might think of improvement. So here we're improving it for the person, not just for the business, and that's really the essence of what we're trying to make the life, the work experience. And Cheryl used that term several times. And even the word engagement is not, you know, how do we engage our people, I think is the wrong question. The right question is, how do we improve the employee's experience so they give discretionary effort, so they actually work in a way that they're in the zone, they get more out of it, and work feels more like fun than actually a real drudge and a grind.
Yeah, that made a lot of sense to me. My thought based on the question was how many times, like the number of times people speak would maybe sometimes be seen who is more involved, and yet sometimes we all see that person says one thing, they've been listening to everything going on, and they make one remark, and it's like profound because they've really captured it. So it certainly couldn't be how much people talk. I couldn't agree more with Peter, what you said about people often being in meetings either too long, or meetings they just don't need to be in, or meetings just aren't clear what they're being held for. Are we here to decide something, explore something? What's the purpose in any given part? I do know that the individuals generally have to drive improvement. If the idea of what are you measuring is to make it better, then the group has to decide what a better meeting is and drive what they believe would be better, and how would we measure better. So I think it has to be the people in the meetings driving that improvement for the most part.
Okay, thank you. Kotha here has a question on how to deal with organisations which do not encourage and acknowledge higher education.
Ooh, I think that's one for you, Cheryl.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I'm hearing is they don't encourage it. I'm not sure if it means they don't offer funding for it, or they don't encourage people to take time for it. So I don't know what I would say about how to deal with them, other than one option is to help them see what the benefit of it is. What I'm hearing is there's a desire to help there be a stronger proponent of higher education. So let's say you have work, it shouldn't require higher education. Why would we want our people, if they want that for themselves, how do we help them create that? I think for some of us who might have ever seen, when you do that, you will see a level of engagement, like that person will never leave you generally. I mean, they're like, if you helped me get this in my life and better myself, then the loyalty they feel for that organization is tremendous. So that maybe they'll be educated and they'll leave us, and a lot of times you just get more. In fact, this last week I had someone ask me, wonder if we make our people so skilled, like what will we do with all of that? Like, wonder if they're too capable. I'm like, our goal is to figure out what to do with that capability. Your challenge is, if they were more able, what would we do with it? And that's a wonderful challenge.
I think just add to that point, that's a great answer, is maybe one of my colleagues sort of, I stole this idea from them, is maybe put the question about what would happen if they don't invest in that higher education. Maybe people will leave, maybe they'll get disengaged, maybe they won't give discretionary effort. And, you know, do you want the sort of things Cheryl was talking about, or do you want those sort of negative consequences which aren't going to be too good for the organization?
Okay, thank you. So we have Ikenna, who says, hello from the UK. How would you as a leader or change agent foster critical reflection by individuals?
Should I go first? Well, I mean, the issue here is that really is what that feeling cycle is about. It is really this sort of planning for myself, developing myself through the flows, and that reflection, as we said, could be a mini reflection, 5 or 10 minutes every day. It could be, you know, 10 minutes every week, or, you know, half a day once a year, or whatever it actually is. So how would you foster it is really going through the thinking that actually, if we want to get more out of our people, then we've got to do this type of thing. So questions to ask the organization is you know, what level of motivation do we have with our people? What level of discretionary effort do we have with our people? What is our turnover, our staff turnover in the organization? And if the questions to these aren't as good as they could be, then what are we going to do about it? And the sort of things that we're talking about are some of the answers to actually doing something about that.
Yeah. In addition, what I would add to that is I've seen in my time around training, let's say, is it was always like tell people things. And then we all said, you know what, you can't telling people stuff isn't training. And then it was like, let's engage people. Let's like have them talk everything over. What I'm partly hearing is how do we foster an environment that more regularly reflects? And what I've been finding is it's partly just taking time. We have a tendency to think like, okay, here's the question, let's talk, instead of here's a question, let's take 5 minutes and let everybody think about it. And the power of sometimes take 3 to 5 minutes to think about it alone is that's how a lot of people progress, because you've given me a minute to slow down and just, what do I think about this? And so it's very powerful. So I think it's inserting that time into conversations, meetings. So how do we first think, then discuss and reflect first? Different other ways that you definitely would, I think, insert mechanisms that encourage people to take a pause and reflect on what they're doing. Like with problem solving, we kept saying, here's a great way to do problem solving. But then we said, why don't you guys just think about how well you're solving problems? Decide for yourself how well you think you're doing it. What do you think you should do better by reflection? And it moves forward because they know people know so much inside of them that they don't access because we're so busy doing things instead of figuring out what we already know needs to be better.
And it goes back to the leader standard work that we talked about earlier. If you actually set out the day, you know, there's the 7:30 to 7:45 meeting, then there's maybe the hour of improvement activity, and then maybe, you know, the 5 minutes at the end of the day is actually part of the schedule, that I would almost have that reflection to think about what we've actually done in the day. And maybe there's once a week, there's a one-to-one with the line manager. So there's, you know, a 10-minute or whatever that's just built into the schedule of everyone. So this becomes, if you think of the neuroscience behind this, if it becomes a habit, it always happens. If it becomes, if you have time to do it, we all know it'll never happen. And the day job will always drive it out. But if you say at 4:55, the last 5 minutes of the day, if that's the end of the day, I'm going to have this reflection time, then it's much more likely to happen.
That's a great question.
So just a couple more questions here. Another one from Vladimir, who said, thanks both. Could you additionally list a few KPIs, so key behavioral indicators? I had personally a lot of problems to find appropriate KPIs for the sites I work with. We had a number of given ideas, number of Genbas.
Okay, well, what I would say is there isn't the list of KPIs. There isn't a, here is the list, go and do it. I think a lot of this is the importance of people being involved in developing the KPIs themselves. So obviously at your particular sites, it will depend on the industry you're in, what are you trying to achieve, what are the behaviors that are good and bad at the moment. So in terms of thinking about the KPIs, so one is what's something that's, you know, we could list 200 or 300 behaviors that we want and measures around that. So the first question is, what are the behaviors that are really important for this particular role or this particular business? And secondly, which of those behaviors are we not performing so well at the moment? And then if you get the two together and say, well, what are the ones that we're actually gonna really have to work on? So one organization I was recently doing this type of work, the sort of things they came up with is how much time are we spending seeking wider innovation or input into our innovation process. So going out and getting external resources or other teams and so forth. So that was actually a behavior. They also had at a micro level is actually a behavior of leaders spending more time listening. So what they found in the team meetings is that the leaders spent the whole time telling people or explaining things or talking about the KPIs, and the team members never had time to actually say anything or the sort of contribution Cheryl was talking about. So they actually said, well, let's put a stopwatch on them. Let's actually see how much time we spend talking and how much time they spend listening. And so that was in an environment where that was important for that team. So more, it's not a here's the standard list. It's work out the behaviors that you need and the ones that we're not so good at doing, and then think about how could you measure that in a meaningful way. So I'm afraid I don't have an easy answer to that one. There isn't a quick answer.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with everything Peter just said. The other piece I've noticed to consider is it can be more challenging than people think to identify a specific behavior. So common times, like people say, we want our people to be accountable, or we want them to be more responsible. Certainly accountable has got to be one of my favorite ones. That word gets bandied about. I'm like, what is the behavior you're talking about? Or I want my people to be more proactive. What do we mean? And a lot of times it's going into your mind's eye and getting clear, if I was watching it, what am I looking at? So sometimes the stuckness here is, I haven't really gotten clear what the behavior is. And for individuals, they may be, I want to be more like, I want to contribute in meetings more. I want to feel like I do a better job with how I show up, or even how I lead a meeting more. If I did that, what would it look like? What would the behavior be that I think would show I'm doing a better job? And sometimes there takes some time, a pause, to kind of figure out what we're talking about to get to that indicator.
So
because we don't think behaviors.
So sorry, so if you take that idea, Cheryl, you know, I want to get better at running meetings. Well, the obvious KPI is how did we feel that meeting went? And ask the people in the meeting, you know, on a 1 to 5 scale, how good was that meeting? And that would be one way, if that was a specific. So that might be a specific behavior I want for myself. So, you know, getting that 360-degree feedback is probably the, you know, and then you might say, well, how could it have been better for you? And people might give ideas. I mean, don't spend, you know, half an hour, but just a 5-minute quick end of the meeting and just say, look, and start the conversation is, look, I'd like a little help if you don't mind, because one of my things I'm trying to do is get better at running meetings, and could you help me with that? And you know, this whole turn yourself away from being the boss and I know more than them, to have this sort of adult to adult conversation that Cheryl is saying, look, I want to get better, you want to get better, this is how I'm trying to get better, which I think will help all of us, and being a little bit humble about it, that I'm not good at this, and you know, how could you help me?
Okay, thank you. So we have the last one here from McKenna again, who said, change programs often face a challenge of sustainability. How would a change agent or leader encourage sustainability of behavior change?
Well, I know a very good 5-day. I know a very good course you could come on if you want to find out in more detail how to do that. I mean, it is basically this moving to manage the people value stream. And you know, we haven't mentioned the Toyota word, but I spent all day with a friend of mine who has the closest to this that I've actually seen out in industry, and he's just retired. He set up 10 meters by 20 by 20 a Bayer room, which basically is the people value stream. And we were exploring this, and you know, the sort of thing I was talking about and Cheryl's been talking about, that's close to what they were doing. It in fact, in some ways, is going further, because it's making that more explicit, focusing on the needs of the individual and the support, the coaching, and so forth. So we think really getting organizations to manage, you know, the product value stream, the people value stream. These are the two key things to actually make the organization effective, lean, and so forth. So yeah. Any additions to that, or?
No, I think it was well said. I think it's something that it takes a bit to consider it, other than it's an individual thing. So sustaining change still has a lot, I think, to do with how we consider it from an individual perspective instead of a group perspective. That there's no just sweeping motions that get a group of individuals to change, because they are all having their own experience and they change in their own ways and many times in their own pace. So we need, when you adjust to it more personally, but I definitely think it's an area that we certainly continue to spend time exploring and figuring out what are better ways to do just that.
Well, one thing I'll say just before we go is thinking about meaning and life goals and passion and all these sort of things that we have. You can probably tell from Cheryl and I, we have a passion for this. You know, we really want this to happen, and we've set up the whole peoplevaluestream.com and various activities, including this. And we're not actually personally benefiting from this financially. We're not taking money out of this. We think it's the right thing to do. So we're doing a heap of research. We're doing sessions like this, and the workshops that we're doing. Yes, there's a fee, but that fee is directly going back into funding the research, the graphics, the website, and the admin, and all that sort of thing. So we're not actually personally taking any money out of this because we think it's the right thing to do. We think business needs to know this stuff. So our hearts, I think, are in the right place. I don't know if we're a bit naive, but anyway, that's what we're doing, because we want people to do this stuff.
Yeah, the only other thing I want to add on to that is we're finding many organizations are doing great work. Some of you here are probably thinking we do some of this. It really is very much about sharing what's known, what are people doing with it, and sharing that knowledge to advance this way of thinking. It certainly is out here for sure, but it's great to try and find a place for us to help companies and organizations find each other and help do even more.
Okay. Thank you. We've reached the end. So you'll receive an email from myself. So any questions that you have for myself, Peter or Cheryl, please just email me and I can pass those on. And I will also be sending out the handout if you haven't already downloaded it. So please look into it or share with your wider community if you have other recommendations of people. And we hope to see you on the 22nd of October. So yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.